Eddington, and today we are going to go over the overview of accommodations versus modifications module. During this module, we hope to clearly define and provide examples of accommodations and modifications for instruction and assessment so that parents and guardians may be better informed to assist ARCs in determining what accommodations and modifications are needed for the individual student. The term accommodations and modifications are two words that people tend to use interchangeably. In special education, however, it is critical to understand that these terms have completely different definitions. Mistaking a modification for an accommodation in your child's individual education program, or IEP, can mean the difference between your child being able to earn a specific diploma. By the end of this module, you will better understand accommodations and modifications. We will show you examples of each and describe the steps within the process of determining what accommodations and modifications will be needed to assist the student when accessing the grade level curriculum. When discussing participation in the alternate assessment, the ARC must document evidence the student meets criterion 3 of the Kentucky Alternate Assessment Participation Guidelines. For the student to meet criteria 3, the ARC must determine the student requires extensive direct instruction and intensive accommodations and modifications. What are accommodations and modifications? Accommodations change how a student accesses the information and demonstrates learning. Accommodations do not substantially change the instructional level, content, or performance criteria. Modifications change what the student is expected to learn, including the instructional level, content, and performance criteria. Instruction should be adjusted for all learners. However, some adjustments have different types of implications. Accommodations and modifications are used to assist students in the learning process. When the parent or guardian attends the Admissions and Release Committee, or ARC, meetings, there will be discussion on accommodations and modifications that are appropriate for their child. Parents and guardians can help identify accommodations and modifications that would be most effective based on the child's needs. They can also be informed of what accommodations and modifications are available to support the child's needs that they may not be currently aware of. All of this information will be used to determine if the student meets criteria 3 to be eligible to participate in the alternate assessment. Let's begin with talking about accommodations. The accommodations will not alter what the student is expected to learn. An accommodation makes learning accessible to all students and allows the students to demonstrate what they learn. The changes are made in order to provide a student with equal access to learning and equal opportunity to show what he or she knows and can do. Some examples are accommodations available to students with disabilities participating in the regular state assessment, the Kentucky Summative Assessment, or KSA, include a scribe, which is a person who records what the student dictates word for word, including format, capitalization, and punctuation. There's a reader who reads the directions, prompts, situations, and passages as written, does not provide any additional information or directions that may lead the student to specific information. They reread the directions, prompts, situations, and passages if specifically requested by the student. Extended time, or which could be regular time, time and a half, or double time. Student must be demonstrating on-task efforts, and it should be documented under what conditions the student will need extended time. Use of assistive technology, which is any item, piece of equipment, or product system that is used to increase, maintain, or improve functional capabilities of a child with a disability. Manipulatives should be free of writing and used only as a trigger to the student as he or she organizes their thoughts. Student may have a 3-inch by 5-inch note card with blank organizers drawn on it, front and back, to help organize the student's thoughts. A calculator, where a student's disability has documented impact on math calculation, reasoning, and under what conditions a student will use a calculator on a routine basis during instruction. The calculator shall not be a replacement for math instruction or assistive technology. Reinforcement or behavior modification strategies, which are positive behavioral interventions and support as indicated in a student's behavior intervention plan and/or IEP. Verbal, tangible, and tactical reinforcements for being on task, use of technology to focus attention or reduce stress, or testing in a separate location outside of the regular classroom. Interpreter, for when a student has a verified disability in the area of hearing and uses sign language as a normal mode of communication due to their disability. An interpreter may sign during the state assessment. It is important for parents and guardians to understand accommodations that are allowed on the regular state assessment so that they can help determine if the student requires the most intensive accommodations in order to participate in the state assessment. If they require more intensive accommodations not allowed on the regular state assessment, then the student may meet the requirements for criteria 3 to participate in alternate assessment. Accommodations can include changes in the following: presentation and/or response format and procedures, instructional strategies, time scheduling, environment, equipment, architecture, and technology. Students who have significant cognitive disabilities may need more intensive accommodations that require more significant changes to the instructional level, content, or performance criteria. Here you see a list of examples of intensive accommodations. The more intensive accommodations may be needed in order to provide a student with equal access to learning and equal opportunity to show what they know and can do. Let's look at an example of an intensive accommodation. To help you as the parent or guardian to understand what an intensive accommodation or modification may be when discussing the student's current needs, let's look at an example. This is an exploration activity from a classroom lesson on the water cycle. Students were given a note-taking guide to use to record important information on the water cycle. On this particular question for the accommodation, students were asked to label the arrows on their water cycle diagram as they watched the video. They were provided a word bank to help with vocabulary. A typical way to accommodate this activity could be to watch a video instead of reading a text or a tactical graph instead of this note-taking guide. More intensive instructional accommodations that may be made for a student participating in alternate assessment might be: 1. Change this from a writing activity to adaptive organizer with a picture bank choices that can be Velcroed on the diagram. 2. Provide a reader for the question, either a peer or an adult. 3. Provide multiple choice picture choices for the questions. When planning classroom instruction, it is important to consider state assessment requirements. As a parent or guardian, you will need to understand that all accommodations provided during instruction may not always be acceptable on the regular state assessment. When considering acceptable accommodations, the ARC should consider the impact of consistently using a strategy for instruction that cannot be used for state assessment. Now, let's discuss modifications. Modifications are made to provide student opportunities to participate meaningfully and productively along with other students in classroom and school learning experiences. Modifications might include changes in the following: instructional level, content, or performance criteria. As a parent or guardian, you will need to understand that all modifications provided during classroom instructions may not always be acceptable on the regular state assessment. These are some examples of curriculum and assignment modifications. Curriculum modifications allow a child to learn different material, be graded or assessed differently than their classmates, or be excused from particular projects. Assignment modification allow a child to complete fewer or different problems than their peers, write shorter papers, answer fewer or different test questions, or create alternate projects or assignments. This is important information to understand when discussing a student's IEP, course of study, and which state assessment they will participate in. Intensive modifications can be made for students with significant cognitive disabilities. A modification will and does alter content knowledge expectations. Modifications alter assessment administrative practices. As a parent or guardian and a member of the ARC, you will discuss what modifications your child or student may need when developing and reviewing goals. Specifically design instruction, course of study, and other components of their instruction and assessment plan. Let's look at one example of an intensive instructional modification for a student. This is part of the general classroom lesson assessment for a 7th grade Earth Science unit on the water cycle. This particular classroom assessment has 33 multiple choice questions that the students must complete. A student may require modifications to this assignment, such as pictures, fewer questions, or fewer choices. This is a highly modified classroom assessment for the same 7th grade water cycle lesson on the previous slide. You will notice that the questions are reduced in complexity and the answer choices are represented with pictures for students who need additional support for a receptive understanding. This classroom assessment has been further modified to include fewer questions as well. It's important for the parent and guardians to understand that this would be considered an intensive modification for a student that may not be available to them on the regular state assessment. After seeing the examples of intensive modifications and accommodations, think about your student's current needs. While the school team may be able to explain the student's needs in these areas, again, you are the expert on your student and their current needs and how it impacts them at home and in the community. Share what supports, either modifying tasks, accommodating them, you have to provide to your student in order for them to participate and function in those settings. For example, are there any tasks at home that you have repeatedly helped them with by breaking it down into smaller steps? So, why is this information important? When discussing participation in the alternate assessment, the ARC must document evidence the student meets Criterion 3 of the Kentucky Alternate Assessment Participation Guidelines. In order for the student to meet Criterion 3, the ARC must determine the student requires extensive direct instruction and intensive accommodations and modifications. This module was meant to describe what accommodations and modifications are and the difference between the two. What kinds of modifications and accommodations are available for students, and how accommodations and modifications will be utilized to assist your student with instruction and assessment. Should you have any additional questions about accommodations or modifications available during state assessments, please contact Lauren Thieneman in the Office of Special Education and Early Learning, Division of IDEA Monitoring and Results, Denver.